for this, the Nobel Prize this last year went to Al Roth and to Lloyd Shapley for their several contributions in matching theory. Let me take a minute to mention Al Roth's part of this in particular. Al Roth showed quite dramatically how important this was for real-world applied problems. In particular, he was motivated very early on by the matching of hospitals to new doctors, residents, that at the time you finish your medical school formal academic part, you have to go to a hospital to get trained as a resident, and there were various algorithms, ways of trying to match the people up, which new doctors went to which hospitals. The problem with the way they were doing it, though, was it wasn't stable. That is, we would go back and we would have this person matched with that hospital, and this person matched with this hospital, and this hospital and that person, that new doctor, weren't supposed to be matched, but they said, each of them said they would prefer to be matched together than with the proposed matches that they had. So there was this question of stability of the kinds of matches that were being put forward. There were two reasons you cared about this. One, that as Eric mentioned this morning, this is like a social choice function. You're saying, what's the outcome that you want? And if, in fact, the outcome that you want turns out not to be stable, you're not getting the outcome. In addition, there was a problem, and that's that the instability led to people making private deals. So the whole thing started to unravel, and people started to match outside the formal system very early in the system. So Al's work was to go back and see how it was that you could design different kinds of systems to generate matches that were stable. Lloyd Shapley's contribution that was part of what they cited for the Nobel Prize was his work with David Gale, showing how it was that you might in fact generate outcomes that were stable. So that literature has been very important. The part that I want to talk about today was the focus that was almost exclusively on complete information. That is, the assumptions of the theory that was laid out were that all of the hospitals knew exactly what the characteristics of the new doctors were. The new doctors knew exactly what the characteristics of the hospitals were. And that on this, it was plausible perhaps that the new doctors would know about the hospitals. The hospitals had been around for a while. You knew what the characteristics were that were good. Where would you be trained well? But it was pretty unreasonable to think that the hospitals would know what the characteristics of the new doctors were. They had some letters of recommendation. Those of us that work in the academic community understand that letters of recommendation are not completely reliable indicators of the characteristics that we care about. So we don't really have a satisfactory concept to fill the role of stability when we have incomplete information. So what we're interested in this paper, what I'm going to talk about today, is something that correlates well with what I just said about the hospitals and the doctors. We're going to have incomplete information. On one side of the match, people will know what the characteristics of the other side are. The other side will not know. And what we're going to be interested in is what we could say about stability. What would be a good notion of stability in a world in which you have incomplete information? So we're going to build on the work of Shapley and Shubik with transferable utility. The very first work by Gale and Shapley that I mentioned was without transfers of money. As in the case with the hospitals and the doctors, there is money that goes back and forth, so that there's some general utility that's generated by a match, but there can be transfers of money back and forth between the parties. So I'm going to work through some very simple examples illustrating the idea that we have. And for most of these, we're going to think of there being workers' types. And the workers' types, typically for the examples, there are going to be 3 workers, and the workers can have types 1, 2, or 3. And that means that there are 27 different possible triples of agents that I have out here. I have agent A, B, C. A can be 1 of 3 times 3 times 3, or 27 different possible configurations of the workers. Firms types can be 2, 4, or 5, so there are 3 firms, 3 workers. They're going to match up somehow. Now, what's different about this from most of the matching literature and from much of the bargaining literature that's somewhat related to this is we're going to talk about remuneration values. This is something that in a couple of papers with Melath and Samuelson, we wrote down a different way of formulating bargaining kinds of problems. And the idea of bargaining in general was the primitive of the problem that you started with for many bargaining problems, is to say that if this worker and this firm get together, they will generate a certain amount of surplus. How do they divide it up? That we went back and said, let's take, in fact, something a little bit more primitive than that, and let's talk about when this worker and this firm get together, this worker gets this much surplus from the match, this firm gets this much surplus from the match, and then the total surplus is the sum of those. Now, it doesn't matter whether, in fact, you say which was the sort of the primitive on this. What were the default surpluses for the worker and the firm if you're in a world of complete information? You can show that the kinds of outcomes you get are pretty much the same no matter how you divide those up for many kinds of problems. For incomplete information, that's not the case. That the papers that are mentioned with Melath and Samuelson, where we introduced the idea of remuneration values, the notion was that in those papers, when you had investments that were made before people came to the market to match, and there was asymmetric information, incomplete information, then it mattered a lot what the remuneration values were. What was the default split before there was some transfer of resources? So for this talk, what I'm going to use for the remuneration values, it's always going to be for a worker, the worker's value before there's any transfers is just going to be the product of the worker's type times the firm's type. Similarly, for the firm, the remuneration value was going to be just the product of the values that they have. So that when any worker and firm get together, the total surplus is just 2 times the characteristic or the type of the worker times the type of the firm. So with incomplete information, the kind of incomplete information is what I'd said. The firm types are commonly known. It's common knowledge what the firm's types are. The worker types are private information, but we're starting always with a match that's in place. I'll say this now, we're not going to talk about how matches arise. That is, the kind of matches we're going to talk about are similar to the kinds of things that Dale Mortensen is going to talk about tomorrow, except that the focus in that literature is typically how the matches are formed and how they break apart. Here, we're only interested in asking what kinds of matches could be stable. We're not going to say anything about how they arise. So that the worker types are private, but in a given match, the firm knows what type of a worker that they have in front of them. They know that, and they know what are the possible types of the workers. As I say, for the examples that I'm going to go through, the workers' types are 1, 2, or 3, not necessarily one of each, but that's the only possible types of the workers. But they won't know, in a given match, they won't know what the characteristics or the types of the workers that they're not matched with are. So a candidate matching outcome with payments or wages from firm to worker, by the way, the payments can go either way. That is, for everything we're talking about, it might be that workers are paying firms, firms are paying workers. So on this, we have the workers' types. The worker A is 1, B is 3, C is 2. The firm types are 2, 4, 5. If we, the circles, the ovals, the ovals represent the matches that are in place. The payments are 0, 4, and -4. The payments are always from the firm to the worker, so this is a -4. That means that the worker is paying the firm 4. So the net payment, the payoffs are going to be worker A and firm A match. They each get surplus 2. There's no transfers. Here, the total surplus, the initial surplus is 12 for each of them, and a payment of 4 to the worker. And similarly, the question is, can this matching be stable? Now, on this, if we looked at that matching, there's this problem, and that's that if I looked at worker C and firm B, they each, if they were matched together, they would each get payment of 4. That would be their remuneration value. They're only getting 14. Together, they could have gotten 16. So that unmatched pair would rather match together than go with the matching that was in place. So that there would be there would be a blocking pair, that is a pair that would destabilize the proposed match that's up there. And it would be this match where each of them, this worker would have a payment of 8. He could pay 1 to the firm and get a net payment of 7. This firm would then get 8 plus the 1 from the worker for a net payment of 9. So both of them would be better off under that. So the worker C would prefer that the deviation only if P was bigger than -2. That is, he wouldn't be willing to pay more than 2 to match with firm B. I'm sorry, if I look at under incomplete information, that the question is, would they still be able to match if there was incomplete information? That is, suppose now that the firm knows what the type of workers might be, they could be 1, 2, or 3, but they don't know which. Firm B knows that in fact its current worker is a type 3 worker. This worker would be glad to work with that firm for any payment that was bigger than -2. Okay? But the problem is, firm number B looks at this and they say, I don't know that that's a worker type 2. What if it's a worker type 1? If it's a worker type 1, what's a worker type 1 getting in his current match? The worker type 1 is getting 5 and paying 4, so he's getting a net payment of 1 in his current match, if it's a 1. If he matches over here, he's going to get 4, and he would be willing to pay anything more than -2 to match with that firm and be better off. So that when firm B looks at that worker that comes to it and says, I'm willing to pay you 1 to work for you, firm B can't be sure it's not a type 1 worker. So firm B would be hesitant to, in fact, accept a match with that worker, given the incomplete information. So now, you might say, well, shouldn't we just put down probabilities of what the workers type are and do expected utility? There are problems with that I'll come to. We're going to use a more conservative way of the firm evaluating offers from workers that are not matched with it. And we're going to say that the firm will only accept offers when it's sure that, in fact, it will be better off. And I'll say more about that as I go on. So, in particular, firm 2's beliefs are going to matter. And that the whole thing that I'm going to talk about are beliefs where the beliefs are not questions of what's the probability distribution, but beliefs about what type of a worker it could possibly be. So, incomplete information. Here's the kind of thing that the paper is about. What are the inferences that a firm might be able to draw? Suppose I had a candidate matching where the workers' types were 2, 1, 3, firms' types were 2, 4, 5, and the proposed match were these ovals that were there. If I look at firm B over here, firm B knows it's matched with the worst type worker. Let's say the workers' types are 1, 2, or 3, it's the worst type, it's getting a payoff of 4. Firm B would be happy to match with any worker that offered to pay it. Any worker that offered to pay it would give it a payoff of at least 4 plus the payment from the worker. If I look at the worker A over here, worker A is currently getting 6. If he matched with that firm, he would be willing to pay anything up to 2. So if worker A, type 2, goes to firm B, type 4, and says, I'll work for you and I'll pay you 1, or anything up to 2, then both the worker and the firm would know that they're better off. So that even with the incomplete information, there are some things that in fact will be unstable. And even with the conservative notion that firms take the most conservative point of view and say, I must be better off no matter what I believe. Okay, so here's a second case of inference. And the second case of inference is the following. If I look at worker A and firm B, if I look, each of them could get, they could get 8 each if they were to match together. And in fact, that's what they're getting. So the worker A and firm B can't block. There's no way that both of them could be sure they're better off. But if I looked at firm A over here, firm A is now getting 0 given the current match in the payments. This worker over here, the worker B, type 1, is getting 0 given the payments. Then worker B would be happy to match with firm 1 at any price, any payment bigger than -2. That is, giving them anything less than 1, given anything less than 2, would make that worker better off. The firm would be better off with any worker as long as P is as long as it pays the worker less than 2. So in this particular place, it's going to be that there's always going to be a payment that worker B can make to firm 2 that would make both of them better off. So that on this, if we applied one round of rationality, that as long as everybody understands that everybody is rational, that the worker would only make offers that are rational for it, and the firm takes this very conservative point of view, then in fact, after one round of rationality, it's going to be the lowest attribute worker will have to be matched with the lowest attribute firm. This is an example illustrating how it would happen in this case. In the paper, we show that in fact that's general. That is, for any match that you have, if it's not the case that the lowest type worker that exists in the problem is matched with the lowest type firm, there will always be a blocking pair for that. So we get some idea of what's going to happen on the blocking, on what kinds of things are stable. Now, you have another example in terms of the kinds of things that could be the kinds of inferences you would make when prices are available as well. Look at the candidate matching of 213, 245, where this is just some price that exists in this particular match. Look now at the worker A and firm B again. Now, in this case, they would be able to generate a total surplus of 16 if they were matched. They're only getting 12. Consider a match between worker A, type 2, and firm B, type 4. And suppose, look at a price of -3. That is, the worker is offering to pay the firm 3. Then what can firm B assume about this? Well, firm B, if this were a type 1 worker and it would have a remuneration value of 4 and a payment of 3, they can't be sure that they're better off. But what this firm can say is, wait a second, if that worker was a type 1, what would his current payoff be? His current payoff would be 2, no payment. He would be getting 2. If he were to match with me, then in fact he would be getting 4, and if he's offering to pay 3, he would only get 1 net. So the firm B can say, look, as long as worker 1 is rational, then worker 1 is better off staying in that match with firm A than he would by coming to me and offering 3. So worker number A, type 2, can signal to the firm B that in fact he's not a type 1 by offering to pay just enough money, 3, so that in fact the type of worker below him, the worst type worker, wouldn't be willing to make that offer. So the firm's inference then, given the assumption of rationality, is it must be at least a 2. Might be a 3, that's even better. But given that inference, the match is then acceptable to the firm. So these are the kinds of inferences that we're going to be interested in this paper. That is, there's going to be blocking, given the kinds of inferences that firms can make about the workers that are possibly coming to them with offers that they're going to make. Now, all of the kinds of inferences that I've talked about, I've shown you already. The point of the paper is that we're going to do this iteratively. It's going to be an iterative process and say, but wait, once in fact the firms are able to make one inference about the possible workers types that exist out there, that's going to lead to the possibility that they say, but wait, given that restriction on what kinds of workers there can be out there, I can make more inferences. And then given that, I can make more inferences. If you're familiar with the literature on rationalizability in strategic games, this is somewhat similar to that. You start with a set of possible, the firms start with a set of possible vectors of workers' types that could exist. Then they say, well, if they're matched up, it must be at least individually rational or the worker could just go home. And now if they're rational, then in fact I know that the lowest type worker that exists must be with the lowest type firm. And then given that, I can make more inferences, and the set of things that are going to be stable after the inferences and the blocking that's possible are going to come down to what we care about, and that's what the main theorem in the paper is, that the only matchings that will occur in the world that we're looking at are going to be matches that are efficient. That is, it'll be one in which the lowest type worker is matched with the lowest type firm, next lowest with next lowest, and so on. I'll have positive assortative matching. That's the only thing that will survive the iterative process of blocking. And given the particular premuneration values, that it's the product of the worker's type and the firm's type, the efficient thing is to have positive assortative matching. Okay, so that's more or less the main theorem. Let me go through a little bit of this formal structure. So, incomplete information. Applying one round of rationality, as I said, is going to give you the lowest attribute worker matched with the lowest attribute firm. If the agents understand that all other agents are rational, then agents should understand that in a stable matching, the lowest attribute worker is necessarily matched with the lowest attribute firm. That's going to be commonly known. Given that, you can then apply it to the set of firms and workers above that and apply it again. And it's going to be an iterative process by which you can show that after a finite number of rounds, there's going to be everything blocked that isn't positive assortative matching. Okay, so the exercise that we're engaged in is going to be what are the implications of common knowledge of rationality, common knowledge of the firm type assignments to firm names, that is, everybody knows all of the firm's types, common knowledge of the payments that all of the people are getting, common knowledge of the match by name, and common knowledge that there's no blocking that's possible. Okay, so there's going to be some formal notation here. It's going to be fairly straightforward. There's a finite set of workers. Their names are going to be I in some finite set of worker types, and the workers' types are just going to be some finite set. That was the 1, 2, 3 that I had before. And there's a finite set of firm types as well. The worker type assignment is just this function that tells you for every worker name what's the worker's type, drawn from some distribution on omega, which was the set of all of the workers, with some distribution. The distribution, the probability distribution, is going to be irrelevant for what I talk about, though. The worker premuneration values, that is a worker type W matched with the firm type F, what's the premuneration value before any transfers are made? And that's for every possible combination of workers and firms matched together. Firm premuneration values are phi, again, just for that's what the firm gets when it's type F and matched with the worker type W. There's a transfer to the worker from the firm, just some P. There's an allocation, which is then going to be a one-to-one matching by name. Worker A is matched with what firm? Worker B is matched with what firm? And the payments that are made. That's the payment to worker I from the firm that I is matched with. The observables are the names of the workers, the names of the firms, by name which firms are matched with which workers, the payments that are made, and then all of the firm's types. That's all common knowledge. The matching outcome is going to be the matching, the transfers, and then some realization. There's going to be the matching by names, and then there's going to be what are the actual workers' types that exist. So individual rationality is just going to be that anybody can walk away and get a payment of 0. So the premuneration value, there's a worker I that has this type. He's matched under matching I with the firm mu I, and that's the firm type. So that's the premuneration value. plus that's the transfer that he's going to get or give. It could be a negative number, as I say. That has to be non-negative. Similarly for the firm, okay? So, complete information stability. Let me just go back and review what it was that was the basis of the kinds of work that Roth did on the matching of residents and hospitals. And that was the idea of stability. When was it that an unmatched pair might destabilize the proposed match and match outside of the proposals? So complete information stable was complete information stable if it was individually rational, everybody was willing to participate, and there was no unmatched worker-firm combination I and J and a payment P such that the worker I matched with firm J, they're not supposed to be matched, but if they match, that's what the remuneration value would be to the worker, plus the payment that he got was bigger than the remuneration value and the payment that he got under the proposed matching. And similarly for the firm, that's what the firm would get under this the non-proposed match. What the firm would get should be better than what it was getting under the proposal. So the stability said that there should be no such pair that could exist, okay? The properties under this were that you had existence of stable outcomes, you had efficiency, that you got, that the outcome was efficient, that is the total surplus that you could get was going to be maximized, and you had equal treatment of equals. If there were two firms of the same type, they got the same payoff. Two workers of the same type, they got the same payoff. Okay, we want to extend this to a notion of incomplete information. And as I say, basically, it's going to be what I'd said before. We want individual rationality. The worker will know whether he's better off or not under a proposed match. And the firm, we're simply going to say that the firm should be better off no matter what possible thing came up, given the restrictions that their inferences made. So that we're going to look at an individually rational set of outcomes, capital sigma. A matching outcome is sigma blocked. If there's an unmatched pair, I and J, and a payment satisfying, the worker is better off. That's the remuneration value plus P is better off than under the proposed match. The firm is better off than they were at the proposed match for all worker types that they might think are possible that are in sigma, that they were in this restricted set that we started with, and that the worker that they know what the type that they're currently matched with, the type of the worker, and that the worker must be better off under this. So if a worker came to a firm and said, I offer to work for you with this transfer, then the firm assumes that the worker must be restricted to those types that would be better off. They know who their current worker is, and they know what are the set of possibilities that they're currently thinking are possible. So that's the natural extension of blocking from complete information to incomplete information with this restriction that it has to be for all, okay? Now, let me stop for 1 second and say, why is it that we want the firm to, in fact, be positive that no matter what their beliefs are, that they can be better off? It's not that we're thinking that the firms are necessarily infinitely risk averse, but rather we're interested in this from an outside observer's point of view. I'm looking at a particular problem. I don't know what the firm's beliefs actually are. What I do know is the following. The firm, if it's rational, has some beliefs, and with those beliefs it might decide that it's willing to block given its current beliefs. If something is blocked in this sense, I don't have to worry what the firm's beliefs were. Whatever they were, this outcome would have been blocked because it's for all possible beliefs the firm could have entertained. So that what I'm going to have when I look at this set is maybe too big because I sit there and say, well, firms might in fact have blocked some other things. But everything that I want to say, that's the positive things I want to say are about the set that's in this. It's a very conservative rule by which I'm throwing things out and saying those things won't be part of a stable outcome. Anything that's in the stable outcome, the theorem that I'm telling you is going to be that all of those will have the property that they have, that they're positive assortative matching. Okay. So the definition of blocking. What this is, as I told you, with respect to a set sigma, what it means to say it's sigma block. Now the notion of, if I fix a set of sets that are sigma, I'm sorry, this is the same thing I showed, the only thing new here. Blocking is hard. No complete information stable matching can be blocked. That is, anything that's complete information stable must still be in this, because one of the beliefs that you have to have is that it could have been the matching, the actual types of the workers. Okay, so the blocking. So there's going to be this iterative notion of blocking. We're going to start with the set sigma, and then what we're going to say is that when I have something that's sigma blocked, well, we get the definition of what it means to be sigma blocked. I'll talk about something being stable if it's not sigma blocked. So it's just going to be the set of things that are not blocked when the firm is considering only the possibilities of the workers' types being in the set sigma. So what's incomplete information stable? That if I fix the set of outcomes, fix a set of individually rational outcomes sigma, the matching outcome is going to be sigma stable if there's no unmatched worker pair that has the properties that I'd said. Now, I'm going the wrong way. So the incomplete information stability is going to be the following. I start with the set of individually rational matching outcomes. Anything that's not individually rational, I assume that it would be unstable, the worker or the firm would walk away. What I then think of is I say that given that I've thrown out some things that are not individually rational, what things are going to be blocked after that? The firm has put some restrictions on the types of workers that can be there. I gave you an example showing the kinds of things that might be ruled out at that next step. That's going to give rise to sigma 1. Sigma 1 is the set of all of the matching outcomes, including the possible worker types that could have existed that were in the first round of sigma stable, the sigma 0, such that it can't be blocked given the restrictions on beliefs at sigma 0. That gives me sigma 1. Sigma 2 will then be what are the things that are stable given that the firm can now restrict its beliefs, must restrict its beliefs, to say that in fact the things that they're considering are in sigma 1. Sigma 3 is a set of things that survive after the sigma 2 possible restrictions are imposed. So then the set of incomplete information stable outcomes is just going to be the infinite set of these things. There's a finite number of possible worker types, finite number of workers, so after a finite number of steps, this process must stop. Okay. So the theorem is that for any worker type vector I have, there will exist some matching and payment such that the matching payment and that worker types are stable. So this will be a non-empty set. No matter what the set of worker types are, it's a non-empty set. So let me go back to an earlier example. One of the examples I had was that we had the worker C and firm B. They can't block because they could only generate 16, and that's what they're getting. The possible blocking pair that we might think of is this pair, because if I look, they could each have gotten 15 for a total payoff of 30, and they're only getting 28. So there's a possibility that they could be better off if the firm could be sure in some way. So consider a match of worker B, this worker, with this firm at a payment of, from the firm to the worker of 1.5. They would each have gotten 15, and plus 1.5 for the worker would have given him 16.5, so he's better off. The firm would have gotten 15 minus the payment of 1.5. That would have been better than their payoff of 12. So that pair could have matched, well, if the firm was sure that that was a worker of type 3. But firm C knows that worker B is not of type 1 or 2, since the offer wouldn't be profitable for such types. That is, let's go back and look at a worker of type 1. If that worker were a worker of type 1, then that worker would have been getting a remuneration value of 4, plus a payment of 4. That worker would have been getting a payoff of 8. If that were a type 1 and he matched with this firm, he would have had a payoff of 5, plus a payoff of 1.5. That's less than the 8 that he could have gotten. So a worker of type 1 could never, in fact, be better off by offering 1.5. Similar calculation, it can't be a worker of type 2. So if firm C, knows that the workers are rational, then firm C can make the inference that that must, in fact, be a worker of type 3. That's the only type of worker that could rationally offer 1.5. So the bottom line is that this is that the outcome is not going to be sigma 0 stable. That is, at that first round, it'll be blocked before the firm makes any other inferences other than rationality. So it will not be in sigma 1, the next round. If I take another earlier example, go back and look at the particular matching that I have here. This was a matching that had the property that this pair, worker C, firm B, could have, if they were sure of their types, they could, in fact, generate a total payoff of 16. They're only getting 14. The problem was that firm B wasn't sure that that wasn't a type 1 worker. And because, in fact, it said that it wasn't a type, they weren't sure it wasn't a type 1 worker, they weren't ready to accept that worker. Okay. But now let's go back and look at this with one more step. If we thought of this, if that worker were a type 1 worker, that wouldn't be sigma 0 stable. The match of worker C and firm A. If in fact that was a worker of type 1, then that worker would have been getting a payoff of 1. He would have been getting remuneration value of 5. He paid 4, would have had a net payment of 1. He could have in fact offered to work at firm A and paid 1.5 to get it, and that would have in fact been accepted by firm A. So that this possibility that worker C is a type 1 won't survive the first round. So while it's true that in the first round firm B would not be willing to accept the offer from worker C because it wasn't sure it was better off, once it goes through and says, but wait, after one round of just rational inference, I can restrict attention to that not being a type 1 worker because there would have been a blocking. So this is the case in which it's not blocked in the first round, but it will be in the second round. So it's not sigma 1 stable. Okay, so this is the process by which we have this iterative process by which the firms are refining their beliefs about what the worker's type vector can be. Let me stop for 1 second. That the slides that are online for the conference, I left in the slides some material that I'm not going to have time to talk about today. I left them in there in case people, I think they're helpful. You'll get an idea of what's in the paper. So I'll skip over a couple of things. I'll mention also that I told you that...
But they have in the slides.
Yeah, so they have the slides. And so I mentioned there was a paper that I'd sent for this. There's a revision of that paper that's up on my webpage. I don't know if you have the revision as well?
I have the link, yeah.
Yeah. So that the paper was revised last week, so there's so there. I'll just mention that there's an alternative way to think about the process of stable, incomplete information, stable outcomes, which is not an iterative process, but there's a fixed point characterization of it as well, which turns out to be useful for proving some results. I'll skip over those for time. Now, to get to the main theorem, the primary theorem in the paper, we assume that there's strict monotonicity of these premuneration values. The premuneration values for the workers, yes?
So you haven't been putting any structure on these things so far, is that right?
I have not. Oh, no. Hold on 1 second. Since I haven't said anything formal other than examples, I haven't put any structure on them.
Yes, but for the characterization.
For which?
I see, you just have a definition so far.
I have a definition and examples illustrating the kinds of inferences that would be made.
And you
Now,
said existence
And existence, yes, existence, I don't need any assumptions for. Right, there, you don't need, that, when I said that the primary theorem is going to be that you get positive assortative matching, then I need assumptions, and that's what I'm putting it now. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so the remuneration values for both the worker and the firm are strictly increasing in the worker's type and in the firm's type. There's strict supermodularity, that is for any worker type W bigger than W prime and F bigger than F prime, then the matching of the highest with the highest and the lowest with the lowest is better than the cross-matching, standard strict supermodularity. And similarly for the sum of the remuneration values. And strict, there's a definition that we'll put in here, strict submodularity. I'm only going to talk about the case in which you get positive assortative matching, for which I'll do strict supermodularity. There's an analogous result for the submodularity. Okay, so the incomplete information stability, efficiency, number one. If the remuneration values are strictly monotonic and strictly supermodular, every incomplete information stable outcome is ex post efficient, then, and that's that it will be positively assortative matching. Now, that doesn't mean that it's unique. The matching is unique. The payments that are made from the firm to the worker are not necessarily unique. So that, but that's, in terms of efficiency, that's just a wash. That's just a transfer from one to the other. The efficiency has to do with, are we matching the right workers with the right firms? And that says that with this definition of incomplete stability, then anything that's incomplete information stable will in fact be an efficient matching. Now again, let me repeat what I'd said a few minutes ago, that we have a very strict definition of the blocking. It's very hard to block because the firm has to be sure that it'll be better off no matter what possible vector of types exist that are still feasible given the inferences it's made. So that says that since blocking is hard, the positive result is relatively strong. It says that if you wanted to have stronger results than that and make blocking easier, it'll be a smaller set of outcomes that you're going to have as being stable. But since the bigger set are all efficient, then any subset obviously will be. Okay, so the idea of the proof is just briefly, suppose that you have a type W star workers matched with a type F star firm with some transfer. Then for any firm type F that's bigger, that is if there's any firm that's bigger than the F star that we're looking at, then there exists a P such that the W star, by proposing this transfer P to firm F, can reveal its type as at least W star. So that this is all going to work by an iterative process. The lowest worker, lowest type worker will be matched with the lowest type firm, next lowest type worker with the next lowest type firm. If there's ties, it doesn't matter which one is going where. And you keep going. And the way this works, the proof is then going to be through this kind of a signaling. That is, what I can always do is I can always signal I'm a higher type worker than those below me by coming to you and saying, look, I'll offer you this much money, and that's enough that I'm better off, but nobody worse type will be better off. So it's that kind of signaling in the inference process that is what gives you this process of building the positive assortative matching step by step. Okay. So suppose every match yields a non-negative surplus. If remuneration values are strictly monotonic and strictly submodular, every incomplete information stable is ex post efficient, positively assortative. So that if you get the same thing for strict submodularity as well. Okay. Now, just a comment that in this, we have made the assumption that you had the strict, that you had a non-negative surplus on this, that we don't think that you need to have that the surplus that you always get is non-negative. But in terms of the proof that we have now, we weren't able to get that. We don't believe that it's, it has to be non-negative. That is, in general, it's easy to construct examples. He said he likes it so much I should go for another hour. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Okay, so let me go ahead. How big is this incomplete information stable set? As I say, that what you get that we think is nice, you get the positive assortative matching, the efficient outcome. You get that it contains all of the complete information stable outcomes, and it's basically going to give you, in general, the same set of matches that you would get in complete information stable, but possibly with different transfers. What I said at the outset, with complete information stability, what you get is equal treatment of equals. It's always the case that two firms of the same type will get the same payoff. Two workers will get of the same type will get the same payoff. If two workers are getting slightly different payoffs, then the one that's getting less could go to the other firm and say, look, I'll work for slightly less than the other guy, and they would both be better off. You get equal treatment of equals in a very straightforward way. You don't get it here. That is, there's in the paper, there are examples, fairly simple examples, in which you don't get equal treatment of equals. Now, the rest of the slides, have to do with
I'm in a seminar right now.
Okay, what's in the paper that is quite similar flavor. This is a world in which there's matching, in which the possible deals that people can make, workers might come, you might think of workers coming to firms and making offers to firms to work for less than their current worker or something of that sort. We look in the paper at the possibility that there's a market. There's a market in which there's just prices for workers and firms, and ask and have a similar definition of stability in terms of whether there will be people that, a firm and a worker that can sit there and say, I'll buy that worker from just given the information of the prices that exist in the market. There's again an iterative process, that is, from the prices that exist, I'll be able to make some inferences about what kinds of workers have what types, and I can go through a similar iterative process. When you do that, what you'll get is you'll get a non-empty set of incomplete information stable outcomes. What you will get, though, is you'll get a bigger set. It'll contain all of the incomplete information stable outcomes that I've talked about here, but you'll get more. The difference between the sort of individual transactions and the market is coming from exactly the signaling that I talked about. In the way we talked about here, a worker can come to a firm and say, I offer to give you this much money to work for you. And there's this individual signaling that you don't get with the market. If the market, if we're just taking the prices as fixed, that the people just transact at those markets, you won't get as fine an inference about the kinds of workers that you would get in the individual. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Andy. Very nice presentation. Are there any questions? There?
Well, a couple.
Couple.
First of all, have you thought about generalizing your conditions? I mean, you've got absolute advantage, and what happens if, for example, you're allowed for comparative advantage?
Say that again. What's the
Well, you have absolute advantage, your assumption of monotonicity. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Have you thought about relaxing that?
When you say the absolute comparative advantage, the supermodularity.
Well, the supermodularity isn't enough for comparative advantage. You need the ratios going in the right direction
Right.
and so forth.
No, I haven't.
Yeah. All right. Yeah.
That I know that a couple of the things that we've tried turn out to be difficult. The techniques that we have start falling apart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was part of it. And secondly, I was your last comment. Just the comment on your last comment, because of course you generated wage dispersion, and I always looking for examples of that. So, right, with these different transfers that can happen. Right.
Some more questions? No? Are you sure?
I'll ask.
Eric?
You mentioned well, you've mentioned several times that you're using a conservative notion of blocking. The firm has to be sure. You mentioned at some point a possible alternative, which is that the firm has to improve in expected utility.
Right.
Is that is that a tractable criterion for generating results? If you use that, could you get existence and characterization of wages?
So let me tell you the kind of problem that you have, if you just said that let's let the firms just be Bayesian, they have a prior. Here's the problem that you run into. Suppose that there's two firms, two workers, the firms are identical, and the workers can either be of a high type, let's call it value 10, or they can be a low type 1. And now suppose I tell you that the workers' types are drawn IID, and high is with probability 0.999, okay? And now suppose that we get this bad draw in which there's two low workers. So each firm is sitting there looking at their worker and saying, my God, only one chance in 1,000 that I got a low worker. The other worker offers to come work for me, and I sit there and I say, it's almost sure that it's going to be a good deal and I'll accept. And of course then for that realization, everything is blocked. You get something empty. Now, so that if you do that, you don't get a non-empty set to start with. Now, more than that, the point of view that we talk a bit in the paper about the point of view of this. And the idea is that what we're interested in is that if I were doing something like Dale does, and if I want to look at some data in a market, and I see some worker and firm matches that exist over time, then in fact I should assume that they're stable because this iterative process has been going on and that people have made these inferences. Now, if I thought about just doing a Bayesian prior, then I'd have to in fact be more careful and I'd have to start doing what Dale's going to talk about tomorrow morning, and that's that the worker comes to me and says he'll work for me for a little bit more than my current worker. And I say, that's a good deal because in fact you're almost surely good. And he comes and he's not any good. Then the other guy, I have to go back and take the other guy again. I have to start talking about how is this process going to take place? That is, there's going to be repeated blocking over time that is going on. Then I have to do something that I said explicitly that I didn't want to talk about at all here, and that's how are matches formed. So that we can say something about matches that persist over time. But how matches are formed, then I have to start talking about an explicit dynamic process and what's the learning that's going to go on in that dynamic process. So that's the disadvantage of going back and treating firms as sort of a standard Bayesian actor.
Steve?
You used a little bit the language of signaling in your talk.
Yes.
The workers are signaling. And I was trying to think if you could use the connection to signaling games could be made more explicit. It has the flavor of a sort of intuitive criterion. And in basic signaling game, you also have this feature that the beliefs don't matter very much. It's just the supports. It's prior free. Have you thought at all about that connection?
I've thought about it a little bit, but I don't think it's interesting to say. That if you start taking the signaling is a nice word to use because you sort of saw what I was doing. But as soon as I started doing signaling, then at least when I started thinking about this, you start running into problems and saying, but if that worker didn't make an offer to me, then what would I have done? That is, I talked about this blocking as being this iterative process, and I formed this thing. I should be careful. That's a pedagogical device. Because if I don't want to think of that as being a real dynamic process by which this is happening, because I could sit there if I were this, in the one example, the type 1 worker that was sitting over here matched up with the best firm. And I sit there and say, I think I can go make a deal with the type, with the low quality firm over there. Say, but wait a second, if I don't do that, there'll be an inference that's made that I must not be a type 1, and then I'll be able to get a really good deal from another firm. So if people start behaving strategically in the dynamic sense, then in fact, yeah.
Are you satisfied with that? Are you satisfied?
Extremely.
Okay. More questions? No? So we got, please, Andy.
Okay.
So we got to the end of this first day. Let me first of all to thank, excuse me, I'm quite tired. To thank our 5 speakers. I really believe they deliver outstanding speeches, in particular because and I can see our younger PhD students and researchers who had the nerve to stay up to this point. A lot of insights and ideas to think about that can be extremely useful for you, first of all, because you are the younger, and also for the other researchers who had the nerve to stay up to this point. And I want also to thank some colleagues coming from the outside, I mean from other universities. It was a pleasure to meet them after quite a bit of time. And just a piece of information for tomorrow. Basically, we are going to parallel exactly what we did today. We are going to start with another Nobel Prize lecture. Let's call it, actually, that will be the presentation of a paper. And then, if you look at the name of the speakers and other titles of the paper they will present, you can clearly find out that even today is not a day that we must lose. Okay? Thank you very much to everybody again, and I hope to see you and all the other people that perhaps were a little bit tired tomorrow morning at 9. Okay? Thank you.